Okay, so today we are going to talk about some tips for teaching yin yoga because this is a style of yoga that has grown in popularity so much in the last number of years, at least since I've started practicing it and teaching it, which makes me so excited. My first experience with yin was as a student, actually. I was teaching at a studio where it was mostly like vinyasa and hatha classes, and then there was a few yin classes on the schedule. And I actually missed the level 2 vinyasa class. I was late for it that I was planning to take that day. And instead, I decided to hop into the yin class. And I went in with all of my ego, thinking like, oh, this is going to be such an easy class. And then the teacher started and was like, we're going to hold every pose for 3 to 5 minutes. And I'm thinking like, okay, this is going to be just this slow, gentle yoga that I definitely was not super excited for. And then she cued us to step into basically a low lunge and was like, okay, we're going to hold this for 5 minutes. And I was like, low lunge for 5 minutes? No problem. What is this class, a joke? And within about 45 seconds of holding it, I realized that it was not a joke and it was a very different experience than just coming to a low lunge when you're there for a few breaths in a vinyasa class. Throughout the very first experience of holding that pose, I went through a slew of emotions, right? Like thinking, this is easy. Whoa, this is not easy. This is really hard. What the heck is wrong with this lady? I want to throw my block at her face. What the heck is wrong with me? This is awful. To then like, oh my gosh, my hips have never felt this open. There's some ease on the other side. Wow, that was incredible. And by the end of that yin class, I realized that something very important was happening, both physically in my body in terms of what was being opened that previously had not been, but also energetically as well. I was left with this kind of feeling of groundedness and this in this meditative state, but yet I had also worked my body, right? It was also an effortful practice as opposed to restorative where it's just about the energetics. And that yin class became a weekly staple at that time in my schedule. I never missed it. And it created a tremendous amount of change for me physically in terms of what I was able to do and access in my body. My stress levels, I think, were reduced. Like if there happened to be a week here and there that I missed it, I noticed a huge difference in my overall mental clarity. And I just think it really started to promote and set me on a path to explore what kind of healing can happen through this practice and how it can be used to address and connect with emotional stuff that we're dealing with as well. Not to say that vinyasa or more active practices can't do that, but the intention is different, right? We don't have to sit with our feelings in the same way that we would in a yin class. So when I ended up leaving that studio and Patrick and I had our studios, there was no one teaching yin. And he was like, well, if you want to go get certified as a yin teacher, you can teach it. And that's exactly what I did. So I went and got my yin certification. I brought that to our studios. We ended up getting more people certified in yin, running our own trainings. I now teach and lead our yin training online with YogaRenew. And it's wonderful to see the way that this practice has grown and evolved and how many more people are attracted to it, because I think it's the perfect balance and it is incredibly needed in an overall yoga practice to have something that brings in this more yin quality, right? When you have a lot of hot yoga and power vinyasa and advanced asana and all of that stuff, which I teach and I love, but I think that's like a huge thing that's very popular in the yoga world. All those yang activities, the practice of yin helps to balance that. So that's kind of my story in terms of how I got into teaching yin yoga. And I think it's just this beautiful offering that helps teachers to be able to balance out the active classes and the active practices that they offer and to introduce it to students as a physical practice, which it really is, right? It targets our physical body just in a very different approach with different intention and in a different way than vinyasa or hatha does, right? The purpose of it in yin is to address the connective tissues in the body as opposed to the big muscle groups. And to work out those connective tissues requires a sense of stillness, a sense of slowness, and a deep connection to breath, which then also allows us to unlock all of the energetics that are energy moving within the body as well. So, okay. Anyway, let's get into the main part, the main thing that I want to talk about today, which is some tips on teaching this practice, because I do think that for a lot of students, this can be a new thing and it can be an overwhelming thing at times. So, in order to be successful as a yin teacher, I think there's some key things that you can do that will allow your students to feel safe in the space that you're holding for them and also enjoy the practice in a whole unique and different way. So, let's talk about these. The very first tip that I have for teaching yin is to start your class with an explanation of what yin yoga is. Yin yoga as a style of yoga is actually a specific form of yoga, right? There's a belief system behind it. There's yin yoga trainings that teach the history and the belief system behind this practice. That being said, all over the place, there are people who are putting yin flow classes on schedules and yin and restore classes and using the word yin to reflect something that's just more calming when it's not necessarily a yin yoga class. And I think that that's problematic because as a result, students will come into a yin yoga class with an expectation that it's going to be like a gentle class. And that's just not the case, right? Holding basically a pigeon pose for 5 minutes, I wouldn't classify as gentle. There's slow, like stillness qualities, but it's not a gentle class. So the first thing that you can do in the beginning of your yin class is just explain elevator pitch what the class is going to be. That way you set the expectation for your students appropriately. They know what the reason is, they know what the style is like, and they're not left thinking like, what's happening in this class? Does this teacher know what they're doing, right? So saying, welcome to class. This is yin yoga. This style of yoga is meant to focus on targeting the connective tissue and the energy centers of the body. In order to do that, we are going to hold each pose for 3 to 5 minutes. This can be intense and overwhelming. It's up to you to find your edge. It's normal if you have any kind of emotional reaction that gets unlocked. Discomfort is normal, pain is not, right? We don't want to move towards pain, but a sense of discomfort in the body as the body opens is very normal. And that's what you're here for, right? Setting that intention, I think, is key because it allows your students to have appropriate expectations for what's going to happen in the class. So just a brief explanation from the start would be tip number 1. Tip number 2 is to work on finding the balance between filling the space with your voice and silence. I think as a yin teacher, if you're holding each pose 3 to 5 minutes, you want to spend the first minute or two offering something for your students to think about in the pose. Now, that could be a physical thing, literally related to the pose. It could be some type of more yogic theme that you bring into your class that in each pose you're kind of expanding upon. Whatever that looks like for you, but giving them some time to listen to your voice, to listen to your words, to offer some thoughts of inspiration, to allow them to kind of find their way into the pose. But then I think there needs to be time for silence to allow them to then have their own experience. And that is a good way that you can cultivate holding space safely for your students, offering them something to think about if they need some assistance in that way, but then making sure that you're putting it on them, that you're allowing them to move through an experience. Even if it's hard, you're still holding the space and encouraging them to move through their emotions and through these poses and unlocking whatever it is that needs to unlock. So finding that balance, I would say like a 50-50, or even you could talk like 60-40, but at least like a good minute and a half of silence, I think is really key and important to a yin class. The third tip that I would have is making sure that the environment itself is set up for students to be comfortable. What do I mean like that? Making sure that the lighting is set in like a very specific way. If you can, obviously, if you're in like a room with full bright lights, there's only so much you can do. But if you can control the lighting, turning the lights down, making sure that the temperature is comfortable, right? Yin practice is meant to be done cold, meaning the body has not been warmed up. But I don't know that it's necessarily comfortable to do it in a freezing cold room because there is so much stillness. So making sure that the room is temperate. You don't want it to be hot, but just like a comfortable temperature. If you choose to use music, which I personally encourage, some type of background ambient sounds that can allow students to kind of tune out any surrounding noise and be able to tune inward. So I wouldn't pick playlists with a lot of words for people to focus on, right? This is more about turning people in towards their internal experience. And music can facilitate that by blocking out any surrounding noise and just letting people have the space to turn inwards. So lighting, temperature, music, scent, if that's something that calls to you, if there's essential oils, or maybe you light a candle ahead of time or burn sage or Palo Santo, whatever, as long as that's safe for the students that you have in the room. Something to activate the senses, creating a space that allows students to be able to step into it and feel a sense of sacredness where they feel safe to be able to turn inwards, right? This is an internal experience when we're talking about yin. It can bring up emotions, and you want to make sure that you're creating an environment for your students to be able to feel like they're able to actually drop into that kind of internal space. So I think that's another key thing in terms of having success in a yin class, is making sure that the environment is set up correctly to help facilitate the experience you're about to lead your students through. And then the last tip that I have, and it's interesting, I taught our in-person yin training at our headquarters recently, and this is something that we talked about back and forth. Lindsay, who is on our YogaRenew team and I co-taught the training with, we talked a lot about this, is your role as the yin teacher, I think more so than in other styles of yoga, is really truly to be a facilitator. But sometimes that means kind of being hands off, right? So you talk your students into the poses, you give them some sense of inspiration, you set the environment up for them, but then you need to allow space for them to do the work, right? So we're not doing hands-on adjustments in yin, unless maybe in Shavasana you want to offer some type of hands-on, but we're not offering hands-on adjustments. It's really about letting the student use gravity in their own body to fully drop into the poses in a way that is safe for them. If they're going through some type of emotional experience, going over to them, maybe just having your presence be there to let them know that it's safe to do so could be nice. But we're not going over if someone starts crying to say, like, it's okay, you don't have to cry. Like, we want them to. If someone has an emotional reaction and there's tears that come up, that's what the body needs. So we're releasing and letting go of those emotions. So being there as a support system should they need you is key, but making sure that they don't feel like they have to push anything down is super important in terms of holding space as a yin teacher. And so in a way, there's more distance physically as a yin teacher than you would see probably in some of the other types of classes, right? In my vinyasa classes, I'm walking around to try and do hands-on adjustments for people or show them and demo what the poses should look like, having that verbal interaction. Like, does this feel okay? Hey, can you bend your knee a little further in Warrior Two? Like, using verbal adjustments to correct. In yin, it's more about people feeling into their bodies and finding a shape and a space and an edge that works for them, as opposed to us facilitating that. So unless a student's asking like, hey, this feels really uncomfortable or painful, can you help me figure out this pose? Then yes, you would want to attend to that and do that. But otherwise, it's about creating room for your students to address and figure these things out for themselves. So there is kind of that like hands-off approach in order to facilitate what needs to happen for your individual students. So after you have set the environment, after you have set the expectation for what's about to happen, and then you've given some type of inspiration for them to think about when you've talked them into the pose, now it's about going hands off and letting them do that. And I think structuring your classes in that way is a way to be able to offer an experience to your students in your yin classes that really serves them and is really driven by them and what they need as individual people, which is the entire purpose, right, of yin practice, of really getting in there and doing that. And so, yeah, those are the key things that I think, some tips for teaching yin that people don't always think about. So as a quick recap to go through everything, some of the key things that you can do as a yin teacher is start your class by setting the expectation for what's about to happen. Set up an environment that facilitates a feeling of openness and trust and an ability to tune inwards. Walking the balance or finding the balance between offering inspiration and holding silence so that your students have something to think about, but then have the space to integrate it in their own way. And then really being hands off and giving them the space to do that, to integrate and work in their own practice. I think those 4 things can help to really differentiate a yin class from, excuse me, from other types of yoga, and can allow for you as a teacher to be able to serve your students in the way that you intend to when teaching this practice. So if you have questions about yin, you can always reach out to me. If you are interested in learning more about yin, I have a free starter kit guide for yin teachers that kind of gives you the background and everything you need to know to like step in and sub a yin class. It's totally free. You can grab that. We'll link it. And if you really want to learn more and you want to actually start to lead classes of your own on a regular basis, we have our self-paced online yin yoga teacher training with me, where I walk you through. It's a very practical training that gives you the poses and the setups and how to sequence classes, talks to you about the history, the energetics, and the intention behind this practice in a way that is like really digestible. And by the end of that training, you'd be ready to go start leading yin classes of your own. I hope this was helpful. Comment, ask questions, send me your questions. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. And I'll see you again soon.